Hello everyone and welcome to this BICS SFT Portal demonstration. I'm Paul Massipon, leading the SFT customer success team at BICS. In today's presentation, I will explain you the basic features available in our portal, allowing you to immediately benefit of the advantages provided by it. Our solution is built around the endpoint. The endpoint is a virtual representation of the end-user device. As in each device, you will integrate a SIM. The SIM will have to be linked to the endpoint in a one-to-one relation. Every SIM will have to be linked to a single endpoint. By the means of APN group, we will define a set of allowed APN for a specific endpoint. By default, BICS APN will be available. BICS APN in one word, and granting access to public internet. If you don't want your data to go through public internet, BICS can provide you a different type of dedicated connectivity, and customized APN will be used to route your own traffic directly to your data center. If you want to use an APN for marketing reasons, this is also possible. Please contact your account manager for more details. For each endpoint, you can define the billing type. The billing type can be postpaid or prepaid. It will be completely independent from the commercial relation between you and BICS. For postpaid, the consumption made by the endpoint will be accumulated over the month and gets automatically reset at the end of the month. For prepaid, every individual endpoint will have its own balance, and the consumption will be deducted from it. If the balance reaches zero, the service will be blocked for that endpoint. When creating a prepaid endpoint, the available balance is set to zero. To allow the endpoint to use any service, the balance will have to be top up. Each endpoint will have an associated plan. You can create as many plans as you want and link the same plan to several endpoints, which will ease your life if you need to customize it. The plan depends on the billing type. You will have to create one plan for postpaid and another plan for prepaid. The first element that we will link to the plan is the service profile. The service profile will define the radio access type, being 2G, 3G, or 4G, that can be used by the endpoint, and the service allowed, data and SMS. Next to the service profile, we will have to define the PCRF rule, which will allow you, if needed, to throttle the data speed of the endpoint and thus limit the consumption of the endpoint. We have also a set of optional parameters which can be defined at plan level. The notifications, which allows you to send a notification to the endpoint or an external party based on predefined triggers like monthly consumptions reached or a service barred. We can also grant some benefits to the endpoint. Those benefits are a one-time package of data or SMS made available to the endpoint. With the counter, you can, for a predefined duration, control the actual usage of the endpoint and define actions to be taken if the volume reaches that limit during the predefined time window. Actions could be temporary block of the servers or reduce the available throughput. The next important element is the roaming profile, which will drive the endpoint's coverage. The roaming profile consists of a set of operators visited network in the different countries where you want to allow the endpoint to connect to. If you want some endpoint to connect only to UK and Ireland, You can create a specific roaming profile with only the operator of those two countries. Associate that roaming profile to the plan and the plan to the endpoints. If one of those endpoints tries to connect from the continent, the service will be denied. This allows you to perfectly control where your customer can use the service. By default, the service used by the endpoint will be charged at the same cost as the price defined by the parent, BICS. Optionally, we can allow you to configure a different tariff for your endpoints. This function is not activated by default because it requires extra configuration and management from your side to create and maintain all the tariffs and associated reference data. The tariffs are defined per service, data, and SMS, and per rate zones, which are a set of operators grouped together per country regions. Typically, you can, for instance, define one price for all operators belonging to EU27 region. The roaming profile will also be directly assigned to the endpoint. If you define several roaming profiles in a plan, you can, at endpoint level, activate or disable one roaming profile for a particular endpoint. Remember our example of UK and Ireland. By defining individually those roaming profiles, one for UK, one for Ireland, you can create one plan with both, associated to several endpoints, and then at endpoint level, allow or disable access to one country. Last but not least, you can lock the endpoint enters the SIM to a particular IMEI. The IMEI is a unique identifier of a device provided by the device manufacturer. Every single phone or IoT device has a unique IMEI. We can make sure that the SIM will only work when plugged in that particular device. If someone steals the SIM and tries to use it in another device, the system will prevent the SIM to use data services and thus consume data illegally. You may say that it's a lot of parameters to be configured and it looks very complex. To make your life easier from the start, your account will be pre-populated with default values for almost all mandatory components, like the APN group, the service profiles, data and SMS, the PCR full. You will have a default plan for prepaid and one for postpaid endpoints. You will have a default roaming profile which includes all the operators available in your account and the default profile ready for the endpoint. So to start using the service, you will have only to create a new endpoint, define the billing time you want to use, assign a default APN group, a plan, and a roaming profile. Link the SIM to it and activate it, and you're good to go. Let's now have a look to the portal. For this demonstration, I will use a test account that has been configured in prepaid mode. This test account is very similar to what you may have for testing purpose or even in production. The costs configured on this test account are of course fake, but the platform is exactly the same as what you may experience. When you log in on the portal, you will first arrive to the dashboard page. This dashboard page provides you information about the consumption done during the current month in terms of data and SMS, the current cost, and in this case, the prepaid balance. If the account is configured in postpaid, you will see here the monthly limit associated to the account. this prepaid balance or monthly limit is the balance at account level. It has nothing to do with some possible balance that you will configure on the endpoint. However, if you reach 0 for the prepaid balance, the services for the endpoint will obviously be disabled. You will also see some historical figures over the last 6 months in terms of data usage and revenues. Now, in this account, since it's a brand new account, there is no historical data to be shown. And you will see on the world map the location where the most of the services has been used. This will be represented by dots over the world map, small dots if the volume is limited, and the dots will be bigger if you have consumed more data in those specific countries. This events report provides information about the network activities of the different SIM cards. I will give you more detail when we will drill down into the details of the endpoints about those events. To start using the service, the first action you will have to do is to create an endpoint. So let's go to the endpoint and we have the option create endpoint. You will have to give a name to your endpoint. That name doesn't necessarily need to be unique. The system will automatically create an endpoint ID, which will be a unique identifier for your endpoint. So this is free text field where you can give whatever name you want to your endpoints. Then we will have to select which APNs that endpoint will be allowed to use out of our APN group. The system has been pre-configured with some default value that we can use for this test. You will also have to select the billing type, so postpaid or prepaid. For testing purpose, we recommend you to use the postpaid option. This will just be easier for you since in postpaid you don't have to care about the balance of the different endpoints. Even in postpaid mode, you have the possibility to specify a monthly limit, which is expressed in terms of money. So this account is configured in euro. So if I specify 50, I will have a monthly limit of 50 euro that I can use in terms of service. If I reach that monthly limit, the service will be anyhow disabled for that endpoint till the end of the month. At the end of the month, automatically that limit is reset and you can reuse the service up to 50 euro or whatever. If you leave it empty, then it will be unlimited. We will now have to assign a plan to that endpoint. We can do that via the little plus icon here. And we get the list of plans available for postpaid endpoint. Since it's a brand new account and we didn't configure yet our specific plans, we still have the default plan available and we will select this one for our first endpoint. Then we have to select the associated roaming profile, which in this case will also be the default one. You have the possibility to lock the device to the SIM thanks to the IMEI. By activating it, you can specify the IMEI on the platform. If you leave it empty, the system will detect the first data session made by the device and the associated email. That email will be then the reference email for that endpoint, and the system will lock the SIM to that device after the first use. You can, via the portal, change it afterwards, but if someone then takes the SIM out of that device and put it in another device, the system will not accept the data session from that second device. Now we need to link the SIM to that endpoint. And again, we click on the little plus here, and you will get the list of SIMs assigned to your account, which are in a ready to activate status. Ready to activate means that the SIM is available for you and not yet assigned to a specific endpoint. So let's select one and let's activate it immediately. The system will then provide you with the MSISDN. The MSISDN is, let's say, the phone number associated to the SIM, and so to the endpoint. This is the number that you will have to use to send or receive SMSs from the device. The add-on plan, we will not work with the add-on during this presentation. This is part of a more advanced explanation. You don't need to fill it in. The add-on is a kind of package that you can assign to the endpoint in a recurrent or non-recurrent way, but we will not present the add-on for this presentation. So just leave it empty. And then you click on Submit to create your first endpoint. So you see our first endpoint has been created successfully. Now, what you still have to do is to configure the end user device with the right APN. So don't forget to configure your APN on your device, otherwise this device will not be able to use the service. Once that is done, we can click here and see the detail of that specific endpoint. So I have switched on my device and configured the right APN on it. So we see the endpoint ID, so the unique identifier of your endpoint, the endpoint name, the associated SIM with the MSISDN. We have here two buttons, SIM swap and D-Link SIM. With the D-Link SIM, you will release the SIM from that endpoint and the SIM will come back to your SIM inventory. You can then later on reuse that SIM for another endpoint. The SIM swap will allow you to change the SIM for that specific endpoint. Pay attention, with the SIM swap, the old SIM will be gone and you will not be able to recuperate that SIM or reuse that SIM for another endpoint. So this is very specific. You will be allowed to change the SIM. You will keep the same data for your endpoint, the same MSISDN number, but the old SIM will be gone forever from your inventory. So be very careful with the SIM swap. If you don't want to use the endpoint and you want to reassign the SIM to another endpoint, please use the D-Link SIM. Then we have a view on the current month usage for that specific endpoint. So as you can see, for the moment it's 0 without any SMS. I have my current cost 0 as well, my monthly limit. And since I configured my APN and I switch on the device, you can see that I'm now connected on Proximus in Belgium on 4G. I will start some data session from the device so that I can show you later on how it looks like when you start using the service. We have then an overview of the configuration of that specific endpoint with the associated plan. With the little pencil next to it, you can eventually change that parameter. It's configured in postpaid with a default service profile and a default roaming profile. You have the endpoint details where you see the status active. So here again, we have the little pencil icon, which means that you can change the status. You can eventually change the APN group, the email. You can also change it. As you can see here, it's currently locked to that specific device. And you have also the possibility to, for that specific endpoint, bar the radio access type or the services. We have a view on the contours, so there's no contour specified on this plan, so this is empty. We have a view on the different events from that endpoint, and here you see all the details of the radio access part, let's say, for that device. So where he attached for the first time to the Proximus network, we create PDP context, which is we initiate the first session, and so on. So we will not go into the detail of what you can see here. This is, let's say, for advanced user if you are familiar with the network signaling on the GSM area. Then you have a view on the usage. So as I told you, I started some test session, and you will see all the traffic that has been already generated. It's an almost real-time system. So when you generate traffic, you immediately or almost immediately see it on the portal. Our system works with, let's say, step of 3 megabytes, and with the fake price configured on this account, each step of 3 megabytes will be charged at 9 euro cents. We have a view on the benefits, if any benefits are configured, and we have a diagnosis page which gives us some information about the status of the endpoint, the status of the account. So the data service is active, SMS is active, the SIM is active. We have the detail about the IMSI associated to it and the different APNs available. If you scroll down, you see also information about the SIM type and some tools to check if some data sessions are engaged. You can eventually cancel the location, which will then force the device to reattach to the network, and check the geolocalization, which will provide you the actual information about the antenna where the device is connected to. With those information, you can query external database to get the actual GPS location of that antenna. Now let's do a refresh of the screen. So as I told you, I had some test session from the device, and you can see that I consumed a little bit more than 100 megabytes uplink, downlink for a total cost of 3.24 euro, which is still below my monthly limit, so I'm still okay. So this is our first endpoint. Later on, I will show you how to create multiple endpoints at once, because if you have to create 100 endpoints, of course, it can be a little bit cumbersome if you have to do it one by one. So next to the endpoint, we will have our SIM inventory, which provides you the list of all the SIMs assigned to your account and with the status of the SIM. So as you can see, we have 4 SIMs in ready to activate state and 1 SIM that is already assigned to an endpoint, which is in an active status. The next menu is the services, where you can specify the different services that the endpoint can use. Services being data and or SMS, and also the radio access type being 2G, 3G, 4G. So if you want to create a specific service profile, you just click on Add Service Profile, and let's say we want to create a service profile which allows only data as service. So you give a name, again it's free text. We select the category, so we will focus only on the base option for this demo. We can activate it from the start, and here you can select the different services you want to assign to that service profile. So you select the one you want. Now we said, okay, we want to have data only, so let's select data only. And in the radio access type, we will allow the different technologies 2G, 3G, and 4G. So by this, we will have one service profile for data only, meaning that the endpoint that will get that service profile will not be able to send or receive SMSs. And you click on Submit to create it. Now let's go to the coverage. So in the coverage, you will have the possibility to create or manipulate the different roaming profiles you want to use. You will get a default roaming profile which contains all the operators, so the possible visited network that are accessible on your account. So in this test account, we have about 300 different networks which are allowed to be connected to. That number may vary function of the commercial agreement you have with BICS. We can create new roaming profiles as explained during the previous part. And let's take our example of UK and Ireland. So if you want that a particular customer has only access to those 2 countries, you will then add a new roaming profile for your customer A. So you create a dedicated roaming profile for that customer, and we will attach to that customer A the network where he has access to it. So we can search based on the country here, or eventually do a search here. So if I type United Kingdom, I get 4 operators available in the UK. So I select the one I want to attach. And we say that we want also to give them access to Ireland, for instance. So you see now we have 6 operators that will be assigned to customer A. We can submit it, and the system has created a new roaming profile for customer A with only those 6 operators. You can then modify it and add or remove other operators to that profile if needed. I explain you also the other option, which is maybe a little bit more administrative, but can have some benefit if you want to, at endpoint level, configure or manage one specific roaming profile. So we can create a roaming profile per country. For instance, let's create one for Ireland. Well, we will take all the relevant operators. And another one for United Kingdom. Let's use here. Okay, so you can also click on attach all. If your filter is well defined, then it will take all the selected operators and we do submit. So, you create for a specific customer one roaming profile with all the operators where that customer will have access to, or if you want to have the flexibility at endpoint level to manage, for instance, specific countries, then you can create different roaming profiles and later on assign them to the plan. Next to the coverage, we have the tariff. So remember, the tariff are by default the same as the cost from your parent. So the endpoint will be charged exactly the same way as the account is charged globally. Optionally, we can allow you to or enable the possibility for you to configure your own tariff for the endpoint, but this requires extra configuration at your side, and by default that functionality is disabled. So this account is a default account where you can see the tariff, but you will not be able to manipulate it. So the tariffs I define per services, so data, and here we can extend the number of rows on our screen, so we see the data and SMS with each time a price associated to it and different rate zones. So the tariff is configured per rate zone. The rate zone is a set of operators that belongs to typically the same region and will have the same associated cost. If you want to see which operator belongs to the rate zone, you can just click on it and you will get the list of all the operators that belongs to those different rate zones. So this is for Oceania, and you will have all the available rate zones here. The price for data, it's in this example 0.6 euro per megabyte. It's also possible to configure it per kilobyte or per 10K. And for SMS, it's always per unit. So it's always one SMS that will be charged. Then we have the possibility to configure different APNs. So by default, you will have the BICS APN. Now, BICS is present all around the world, and to optimize the traffic to public internet, we provide you the opportunity to select the region where you want to break out to public internet. So we have created for you 3 different APNs, one called America.BICS, one BICS APN, and one Asia.BICS. With America.BICS, obviously, we will break out in the Americas, being in New York in this case, where we will then send your traffic via local ISP to reach the final destination on the public internet. With BICS APN, we will break out in Europe and use internet service provider in Europe to reach the target destination. In Asia, so with Asia.BICS as APN, we will break out to public internet in Singapore, and you will access then the public internet via Singapore. So depending of your location and your target, let's say websites or destinations on the internet, it might be more interesting for you to use America.BICS or Asia.BICS if your traffic is mainly in those regions. So you are free to use any of those APN to access public internet. If you have a customized APN, this APN will also be available in the list, and you can, if needed, create a specific APN group, which will then force your endpoint to only use that specific APN. So I will demonstrate it, how to do it, let's say by using the America.BICS as APN. So let's call it my APN. And then you, out of the available APNs, you will have to select your customized APN, for instance. The system then automatically check it out. You can add others if you want and you to allow the others. But by doing this, if you assign my APN to your endpoint, that endpoint will only be able to use this specified APN. If it's a customized APN, then the endpoint can only use your customized APN. And you click on Submit to create it. So now we have 2 different APNs group available, my APN and the default one. Let's now have a look to the plans. So as explained, you will have to define the plan for postpaid or for prepaid. The system is pre-configured always with a default prepaid and postpaid plan. To create a new plan, you will have to click on the plus here and you come to the Create Plan window. So we will do a base plan and let's give a name. Again, it's free text. So plan 1. We will select the service profile that we have created here. So we create one data only. So let's use a plan that will be for data only. The currency is the same as the one on the account. So this account has been created in euros. So everything will be in euros. The PCRF rule, so basically the possibility to throttle the speed, can also be configured here. Now let's use the default one, meaning we don't want to limit the speed for the endpoint, we will select the roaming profiles coming from the coverage. So here you can or select the default and give the full coverage, or select a customized one with, remember, all the operators for available for that specific customer altogether, or the more, I would say, complex one, but I will just demonstrate this one. You can select different roaming profiles together and then at endpoint level manipulate them if needed. So those are the mandatory parameters, and then we have a few optional parameters. So the first one is the notifications, where you can define a certain set of notification types. It will depend of the type of plan, so if it's prepaid or postpaid. Let's say if we want to notify the endpoint that he has reached his monthly limit, so we select monthly limit reached. To notify the endpoint, the only way to notify it is via SMS. So you select your language and you type the text that the device will receive. You can configure additional recipients, so send a similar message to other people. And here we have different options, so we can also decide to send an SMS. We can send an API back to your data center via an API call, so a post API, where we will define then the body of that message, or simply an email. So you can configure your email address or multiple email address in comma separated. You can specify the language, and in the body you can also specify via those kind of code the short names that you want to have in the text. So basically with those short codes it will replace the code by the actual value. So for instance, we want to notify that endpoint with ID, and then I use the code 33 has reached the monthly limit. So by tapping this, I will receive an email saying endpoint with ID, and the actual endpoint ID has reached the limit. You attach it and then you can submit. The benefits, you can also then define a kind of one-off benefit for all the endpoints that will get that plan. So since we use a service which is data only, we can only select data in the benefit. If you have a plan which is for both SMS and data, you can also configure a benefit in terms of SMS. For data, you specify, let's say, you give 100 meg from the start, and we add it. We can also specify those 100 megabyte if we want to limit it to some rate zones. So in this account, we didn't yet configure new rate zones, so this list will be empty. If you say, okay, I want to give 100 megabyte, but only to the UK and not to Ireland, for instance, then you will have to create another specific rate zone UK only, where you will then be able to assign those 100 megabytes to UK only and not to the rest of the world, for instance. Now for this example, we will do it like this, and then it will be 100 megabytes for all the available network in the plan. So we add it. And then we have also the counter as optional parameter. So we can configure a counter so we can measure per day or per month. So let's take the example of a daily counter with a threshold value. So that is basically the threshold that you want to configure. And let's say I want 100 megabyte. So I will limit to 100 megabyte with the frequency factor, which is basically a kind of multiplication factor of the frequency. You can eventually configure, so if I configure 1, it will be 1 day. So I can use 100 megabyte over 1 day. If I configure, for instance, 7, it means over 7 days, I can use 100 megabyte. So basically, over a shifting window of 7 days, I can consume up to 100 megabytes. If after those 7 days, I have less than 100 megabytes in my counter, that counter will be reset to 0, and I can again use another 100 megabyte the next 7 days. If during that window of 7 days I reach my 100 megabyte threshold, then the action that we define here will come in force, and you can or block the service. So the service will be blocked till the end of that 7 days period. Default, you will do nothing, or you can limit the speed. So here, let's say I want to block my service if I reach more than 100 megabyte over 7 days. Okay, so we assign that to the plan and we click on submit. So now we have our new plan created, which is available here with all the basic information we have configured and the optional parameter available. So now I will explain you how to give access to other people to your account. So basically you have to click on this little icon here. You select the option create user. You have the possibility to create or an administrator who has access to all the different menus and can change everything that is editable, or a read-only profile that will have access to all the different menus but will not be able to change anything. So you give a login, so reach only user, for instance. The email of that person. So the system will send an email to that person with the invitation to create his credential. It's important when you create your login to use Google Chrome as web browser to avoid any problem. So please, in all cases, use Google Chrome as web browser. The other browser, you may experience some problem. So you do that, you submit, the system sends an automatic email to that person, and he or she can then create his password. I will not do it here, not to pollute, let's say, the system. When creating the endpoint, I told you that it was also possible to create multiple endpoints at once. So let's now have a look on how to do that. And basically, you need to go to that little icon with the, let's say, the toolbox, and you select bulk provisioning. Then we create a bulk provisioning sequence where we will have to fill a few mandatory parameters. For instance, the endpoint name, so you can again reuse the same name as before, but you need to specify an ID. So we have created the endpoint 1 manually, so let's create now endpoint 2 and so on. So the system will automatically increase that index by step of 1, function of the number of endpoints that you want to create. So here, system will create endpoint underscore 2, endpoint underscore 3, and so on. Then we will have to select the APN group that we want to assign to those endpoints. So here we have our default APN, but also the one that we have created before. So let's select this one. You have to specify the billing type, so prepaid, postpaid. Let's continue in postpaid. You have to select the plan that will be assigned to all the endpoints that we will create. And here we see our default plan, but also the plan that we have created just before. So let's select this one. On this plan, remember, we have assigned 2 different roaming profiles. So we can select those 2, activate our SIM. We can specify an add-on plan, but that's not relevant here. And we can specify a monthly limit. So let's say for each endpoint, we will give 25 euro as monthly limits. And then you have your list of available SIMs on your account. So in this account, I still have 4 SIMs available to be assigned to new endpoints. So you select from the SIM range which range you want to use, and you specify the quantity. So let's say here I want to create 3 endpoints. So the system will create endpoint 2, 3, and 4, starting with the SIM ending with 05, 06, and 07. Of course, you can put a higher figure if you have more SIMs available on your account. Let's submit it. And so now the system has created 3 extra endpoints for us. Let's now have a look to those endpoints. So you see the endpoint 1 that we have created before, and then endpoint 2, 3, and 4. If we go to this endpoint, you see that he has the plan 1, postpaid data only as service profile that was assigned to the plan, with my APN as APN group, and the 2 roaming profiles that we have assigned. Now, if for that specific endpoint, the endpoint 2, you say this one, you should not have access to Ireland, then you can just disable it by clicking on the roaming profile, and that endpoint 2 will then only have access to UK. Endpoint 3 and 4 will still have access to Ireland and UK. So that is the advantage of creating different roaming profiles and assigning to the plan and so to the endpoint. That's then at endpoint level, you can eventually manipulate or activate or disable specific roaming profile. If we would have link the customer A roaming profile to the plan, then we would have only get here customer A as roaming profile, and you cannot manipulate them at country level, which is probably the most frequent case, but I want to demonstrate you this option as well. Since we have also activated some optional parameter on the plan, we will see them here in the counter. So we had a counter with 100 megabyte daily over 7 days, and then we blocked. So you see the configuration of that counter here. On the benefits, we had also configured a 100 megabyte benefit, which is also visible here. And on the diagnosis, you will see the actual consumption of that data counter. So for the moment, it's still 100 MB because the endpoint of the device hasn't been used yet. Once you start using the service, you will see that counter decreasing and being reset after those 7 days if it's configured based on 7 days. Almost all the manipulation and the changes that you can do via the portal, you can also automate it and launch them via APIs. With this little icon, you will get a view on all the APIs that we currently support and some examples on how to use them. So for instance, you can navigate on the list of API, have a look to the endpoint, and we can, via API, create an endpoint. You have the list of all the mandatory and optional parameters that you will need to specify to create your endpoint, and the system provides you also some example on how to create, for instance, an endpoint via API with examples of the parameter and the format to be used. Thank you for watching this video. I hope it will help you to do your first step in using the BICS SIM portal. If you have extra questions or need some clarification, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. We will be more than happy to help you in using our services.